Greetings friends and welcome to the Imperium's Most Wanted. I'm Lorcan and this is OnlyWar. In this entry, a continuation of what has now become a special edition series. We will cover the events from the devastation of a craft world following a failed ascension to demonhood, through to the escape from the clutches of an enigmatic preserver of history. There will be treachery, elation, and painful sacrifice for the hero of our tale, as he and his followers continue to strive towards his realization for the vision of the future of humanity, the dawn of new man. Before we get started, a huge thank you to everyone who has subscribed as we close in on 10,000, and for all the supportive and helpful comments you've given me this last year. Special thanks to those on Patreon whose support is making a huge difference towards the goal of being able to dedicate more time to producing videos for the channel, and if you're new here, I hope I earn your subscription today. This entry covers events contained in the excellent books Primogenitor and Clonelord by Josh Reynolds. As always, I would highly recommend reading this series from the Black Library yourself. The day will come, my dear, when your children's children stride the galactic rim as the kings and queens of all they survey. But first we must teach them how to survive until that moment. In your generation there were 500. Of them all I kept only you and your closest siblings. The rest are scattered across the galaxy, burrowed into the flesh of the dying empire, so that they might guide it to its well-deserved and long-overdue grave. They and their children carry my teachings into the dark. Generation upon generation, their strength breeds true. As mankind dies, so it nurtures its own replacement, all unknowing. But you are different. You and your kin are to be my hand on the throat of the future, for my brothers will not surrender to fate with dignity. Those who remain after that final hour will fight one another for the right to rule the ashes. And in that moment you and yours shall assert yourselves for the first time and the last. You will hunt angels in the days to come and make a new kingdom from their bones. I imagine I will be the first amongst the foundations, my dear. There will be no place for me in the paradise to come. But until then, I persist. Until my work is done. In part 2, we left the story of Fabius Bile as he and his companions have just escaped from the craft world of Lugganath, having seen Kasparos Telma fail in his attempts at ascension to demonhood. Fabius had extracted with the pitiful remnants of the 12th millennial 3rd Legion that had been under his command at the time of the Radiant King's failed ritual. Several centuries have now passed, and although the 100 or so Emperor's children that remained of that cohort have proved useful in the constant warfare of I-space, their dissatisfaction had grown steadily. Now they rose up in a coup that, while not unexpected, had been swift and fierce as they attempted to seize control of Fabius's ship, the Vesalius. So far, the mutinous legionnaires had been contained to the areas of the ship below the gunnery decks, where tribes of Fabius's mutants held sway and toiled at the behest of their master, and the voices they heard from the corrupted machine spirit of the ship itself. The members of Fabius's consortium were being led by Arian, the former apothecary of the World Eaters, as Fabius would be indisposed at the time of the coup. Arian and the other members of the Apothecarian on board would not be alone in defending the ship from the rebellious members of the 12th Millennial, as alongside the mutants that made up the crew were also the Glandhounds, the apex, so far at least, of Fabius's experiments in what was possible for humanity and specialized Astartes hunters. The Glandhounds were still being led by Igori, despite the centuries since her creation at the benefactor's hand. She would now be an old woman and matriarch of her kind, mother and grandmother many times over, still potent and deadly, but feeling the creeping hand of time as her descendants rose in numbers, and knowing that soon some would seek to challenge her as first amongst firsts. The Glandhounds were Fabius's new men, created at first augmentation after augmentation at the chief apothecary's hand. They now needed no fleshcrafter's knife to grow their population. The first pack had split as their numbers grew. 2 packs became 4, then 4 became 8, as they became a new race themselves in the darkness of the ship's lower decks. An army completely loyal to Fabius. Igori's extended family had corralled the 12th millennium into the flesh market, as Arian had instructed, but now it was time for them to hunt. Fabius himself was undergoing the latest cerebral transference into a new cloned body when the mutiny occurred, his previous body having succumbed once more to the cancerous blight to which he believed himself the last true sufferer. Now his consciousness was returned, and he was reunited once more with his chirurgeon, the complex near-sentient surgical harness that was nearly permanently attached to his back. It would be time for him to resume command of his ship. The transference should have taken a few hours, but the 12th millennial had been waiting for this moment, and he had been indisposed for a few days. Luckily, the cacophony, the noise marine choir under the leadership of Ramos, bull of the 8th millennial, had not joined the mutiny. Nor had the rebels attempted to release Diomat, the hero of Walpurgis, and the last remaining ancient contemptor dreadnought to have survived the assault on Lugganath. Fabius had dealt with rebellions on board his ship before, but this was different, and when he awoke from the tender administrations of Apothecary Korag, the former grave warden of the 14th Legion, he recognized he may need to erase what was left of the 12th millennial entirely. This brought him some small measure of sadness, as they were one of the few remaining reminders he had of the 3rd Legion as it was in simpler times. Now his legion was long dead as a unified military force after centuries of excess and attrition during the Legion Wars in the Eye of Terror. The death blow had been struck by Ezekiel Abaddon as, at his direction, the dying cruiser Talok had plunged from orbit above the world of Harmony and destroyed the Canticle City, the last fortress of the Emperor's children. Fabius would be the one to unleash Diomat, promising the ancient dreadnought that he would be able to choose the manner of his own death and the solace he sought in that final rest, if he granted Fabius his aid in quelling the rebellion on the ship. The Clonelord led his assembled forces to the flesh market where the 12th millennial were holed up, once a near shanty town where the mutant crew had erected a makeshift bazaar on a common causeway. The flesh market was now a ravaged ruin, corpses piled up in a bulwark manned by the remaining legionaries. The rebels were led by Thalopsis, who had commanded their huntsman bikers, and Savona, a former mortal who was now a tall, lithe champion of Slanesh. She had risen to prominence in the warband as part of Telma's inner circle, the Joybound, a position of power unusual for a non-Astartes amongst the warbands of the traitor legions. The 12th millennial had been forced to abandon their own flagship, the Quaz Hazat, when the dying vessel was boarded by troops of Harlequins in the aftermath of the events on Lugganath. The Harlequins dogged Fabius still, shadowing his movements, but remaining mostly on the edges of his awareness. The intervention of Diomat swiftly ended the resolve of the rebels as he surged forward to challenge Thalopsis and crush the head of the renegade biker. Savona would be ordered to accompany Fabius on his next expedition, alongside 1/10 of their number, who would be pardoned the summary execution of decimation if they survived the mission. In the centuries since Lugganath, Fabius had populated numerous frontier worlds with his new men. Since an incident on the planet of Paramar, where his creations had ruled openly, and when discovered he himself had been killed, Fabius had exercised greater caution and selected planets safely spinward from the core of the Imperium to seed his creations. The Vesalius would soon reach its destination, an elder webway gate, floating amidst the broken fragments of a long-dead world. Across its surface, countless thousands of demons crawled, writhing and squabbling amongst themselves, but prevented from detecting their arrival due to the word-bearer Sekira's skill in warding them from demonic attention. Over the centuries, Fabius had begun to carefully explore spurs of the webway, using a captured corsair that initially the chief apothecary had taken for its knowledge. Now he had repurposed the former Eldar, using the wraithbone he had taken from Lugganath, the same substance he had cultivated to grow through the Vesalius, with the aid of the Noise Marines, into a living psychic resonator. Fabius had renamed the former Eldari after its new purpose. He now called it Key. The wraithbone grew within it, permeating its pale flesh and erupting from its wasted form in thorns and sensor filaments. As it moved, the psychoplastic moved with it, thickening and rising up beneath its tread. Using the frigate's weapons turrets and defensive batteries to clear the Neverborn from the gate, he ordered Key to open it, and with the wraithbone resonating with unperceivable sound, the flat sheen of the gateway began to crack, and they plunged forward, targeting the control node of the portal with precise fire, so it remained open as they surged into the webway, trailing the demonic horde behind them. On their display screens, the pan-galactic expanse of navigable tunnels spread out around the ship in all possible directions. A labyrinth of scalloped coils curving away at impossible angles, at once a thing of the materium and the warp. A sideways place, existing between what was and what should not be, spanning entire dimensions. To Fabius's eye, the glowing tunnels reminded him of an exceedingly complex network of capillaries and arteries, running through some vast, unknowable corpus. Despite his many conflicts with the Eldari, the Clonelord could not help but marvel at its beauty, and mourn that such grandeur would not be seen in the galaxy again. Soon they sighted their destination, an ancient craftworld much like Lugganath, but long dead and adrift in the webway. Most such husks were badly damaged, or infested by the Neverborn, but this one was eerily intact, its empty galleries and untended habitation domes having seen no light in countless centuries. Fabius, with members of his consortium and his glandhounds, including a pair known as the Twins, along with Savona leading the members of the 12th Millennial, selected for decimation, made their way through the fluted columns and fragile walkways of the long-dead world. Whatever had happened here had done so swiftly, leaving little sign of the havoc it had undoubtedly wreaked. There was nothing here to attract the attention of demons. The Neverborn had left the silent vessel untouched. It was a tomb, floating quietly in the webway. The expedition would collect samples of wraithbone and parchment containing knowledge of ancient Eldari genecraft. They would also encounter some organisms as they passed through the halls, including a bloom of Medusae, the Xenos resembling conglomerates of free-floating brain matter and ganglia. But soon they would be ambushed by a more familiar foe, the Harlequins making their presence known gracefully, dispatching traitor marine and glandhound alike as they laughed and sang. Fabius ordered a retreat, preserving what plunder they could as the gaudy Xenos harried the retreating renegade party, all the while taunting Fabius, the one they call the King of Feathers. The Harlequins weren't alone either. Eldari corsairs of the Sunblitz Brotherhood, the former comrades of the one Fabius now called Key, accompanying them. They managed to extricate themselves from the deadly ambush only to find their assault lander was gone. Unbeknownst to Fabius, the Vesalius was also under attack from the Eldar. Both Harlequin and Corsair fighter vessels buzzed around the much larger frigate, preventing it from launching its own gunships in response. Suddenly the Xenos fighters broke off as Stormbird assault landers and smaller Storm Eagle gunships, bearing the colours and insignia of the 3rd Legion, appeared in the webway and drove the nimble Aldari fighters off. Although Shakara, who had remained on the Vesalius, suspected this was less a rescue and more a boarding action. Things were not improving for Fabius either. Not only were demons now being attracted to the violence of the conflict on board the craftworld, but the Harlequins also reappeared. This time with the Shadow Seer Silandri Vale Walker leading them to confront the chief apothecary. As on Lugganath centuries earlier, Vale Walker taunted Fabius that he could not escape his fate, the role in their performance he was assigned to play. His forces were being isolated and cut down, but Fabius remained calm, determined to identify the performance as the murderous cyclone played out. However, before Fabius could target the main players, a gunship hovered before the open docking bay, opening fire on the Harlequins and driving them back before landing and disembarking a phalanx of amethyst battle plate, as warriors of the 3rd lay down a curtain of explosive bolter fire. Leading them was Flavius Alkenex, prefect of the Phoenix Guard, and he demanded Fabius's surrender, not in his own name, but in the name of Lord Commander Eidolon. Accompanied by the Lord Commander Primus's battle barge, the Wage of Sin, the Vesalius departed the gateway, leaving the craftworld intact, but destroying the dimensional gate at Fabius's insistence. The chief apothecary had never counted Eidolon amongst his many enemies, and since the destruction of Canticle City, he had seemed to keep his distance, despite the rumours he was now leading a group called the Phoenix Conclave that sought to rebuild the 3rd Legion. Confined to his laboratorium, Fabius continued his experiments and mused both on his current predicament and the continued attentions of the Harlequins. He thought of the various futures he had witnessed back in Lugganath's grove of crystal seers, and the portents and omens he had seen since. In some, he succeeded, in others, he failed, but always his survival depended on turning from his path. It seemed that to rise up, his new men required he perish first. An outcome he was nominally comfortable with, but one that grew increasingly more questionable. His death now would leave them rudderless. They were still as children, still imperfect. He needed more time. He could not die until his work was done, but eventually even a rational mind must bow to an excess of fact, no matter how fanciful it may appear. In the decades since he had become aware of the Harlequins' interest in him, he had begun to question the nature of fate, his fate, and that of his creations. To believe in fate was to resign oneself to the limits of one's existence, something Fabius had never been able to do. Fate said he should have succumbed to the blight that ravaged his body. Fate said he should have sunk deeper into the mire of depravity and excess that had claimed his brothers. Fate said he should have been dead 1,000 times over. If you've been enjoying this episode so far, I hope it's your fate to hit the like and subscribe buttons, and maybe even leave a comment for the blessed algorithm. And now, back to our tale. Fabius would be taken to Harmony, a broken world, a ghost of the hellish paradise it once was, its largest wound where the ruins of what was left of Canticle City still remained. Being led through the blighted city, Fabius observed many signs of his own handiwork scattered through the devastation. Fleshy creepers and strange growths of fibrous meat, malformed creatures and biological sensory nodes. His facilities on Harmony had been extensive, exceeding even those on Urim. By the end, nearly 2/3 of the city's substructure had been given over to his needs. Finally, they winded their way through a labyrinthine structure until they came to a pair of great steel doors covered in lewd carvings that seemed to flex and writhe as they were opened. Beyond was a makeshift amphitheater that greeted Fabius's arrival with a howl that buffeted him with its force. There were cacophony and worse in the gantries above, bedecked in hooded white robes threaded with gold and leering golden face masks of androgynous demons. On a crude throne sat Lord Commander Primus of the Emperor's Children, Eidolon. Fabius could see that Eidolon was much changed from the warrior he'd once conspired with, and in the face of their hostility, he demanded to know why he'd been brought before the Phoenix Conclave. Eidolon revealed that he had received a message from their Primarch, a message borne by a beautiful dancer, whom Fabius suspected was Melusine, one of his earlier great successes, stolen away by Fulgrim long ago, who he knew reached out to haunt the dreams of Igori and whisper warnings to her. That message was to gather those who still had the courage of their convictions, those who sought perfection and sought to bring it to the universe. Through ultimate entropy, the Phoenician would soon arise from his self-imposed isolation, and all that was imperfect in the galaxy would burn. Eidolon would see Fabius return to the fold and join the Conclave, but only if he survived his test of worthiness and the punishment for his dereliction of duty. Mutants brought forth a being held in a web of chains that Eidolon proclaimed to be the last priest of Davin, or at least that was what the creature had once been. Now it was as if its limbs and digits had been stretched to twice their original length, and a cage encased its flattened skull. It appeared to drink in all sound and light as it hovered above the ground. The creature called itself Questor, and it claimed to have shadowed the fate of Fabius and the Third Legion since the Temples of Lair. When it clapped its hands, time stretched out, freezing all except Fabius and itself in a grim tableau. The Questor would claim that Fabius had committed crimes of such elegance that even the gods themselves had become wary, and that they would sit in judgment. Pointing its long finger upwards, Fabius looked into an impossible visage, too vast and all-encompassing to be called a face. It appeared to return its gaze, and it cut through him like the sharpest knife. Pain and pleasure, agony and ecstasy. Fabius tore his eyes away with great effort. He once again denied the existence of gods, proclaiming them for the weak. The Questor had expected this response and questioned Fabius on his findings on the nature of the blight that had plagued him for millennia. Fabius would call it a collection of cellular anomalies, complex and evolving, but a purely biological affliction. The Questor would disagree and make one final statement.
Your destiny is a fractal of impossible complexity. The shadows of empires past, and those yet to be, seek to simplify that pattern for their own ends. You and those like you are nothing more than weapons aimed at the future. The only question is, which future? By whose hand will you be aimed?
Time would then resume, and the Questor would cast its pallid gaze around the assembled conclave before passing its judgment. It found no guilt in Fabius, and his trial was at an end. Shouts of disbelief and anger met the verdict, but Eidolon silenced them and bade the chief apothecary to speak with him in private. The Lord Commander Primus would reveal it was indeed Melusine that had spoken to him, and had shown him where Fabius could be found. He says that Fulgrim wants him chained to his throne, an ornament for his pleasure gardens, but Eidolon has a greater purpose in mind. He has found the location of the lost gene tithe, still intact, viable, and ready for the taking. The lost gene tithe was the first blow suffered by their legion, following the Proximum betrayal, when the Third earned the right to wear the Aquila. A portion of their gene seed reserve had been dispatched to Luna for safekeeping. The tithe ship never reached its destination, and the circumstances around this event were shrouded in mystery. The emergence of the blight in their gene seed vaults on Terra had followed not long after, and the loss of the gene tithe was swiftly forgotten as that disaster unfolded. Now its location had been revealed on the eastern fringe, kept on a world that was not a world, and as chief apothecary, Eidolon said it was Fabius's duty and responsibility to go and retrieve it. In return, Eidolon would offer him the protection of the unified Third Legion, even from Abaddon, with whom Eidolon was an occasional ally. Fabius would be able to craft the Legion anew, and gain the good graces of his brothers, while buying the time he needed to perfect his own creations. Weighing up his currently limited options, Fabius agreed. The accord struck. Fabius was given leave to enter the remains of his first great laboratorium, to see if there was anything that could be salvaged. Precious little remained of the wealth of materials he had amassed, but he did notice that some machinery, too large to have been taken by opportunistic scavengers, was missing. Not only that, there were still some active power conduits leading down into access tunnels beneath the city. He followed these, traversing the passageways deeper until he came across mutants that abased themselves before him, descendants of those he had selected as his assistants long ago. They led him deeper into the tunnels, praising the Pater Mutatis, malformed faces raised in adulation until they reached a deep chamber filled with banks of scavenged flesh vats and cloning tanks. His attention was drawn to a humming bio unit, one of 20 he had constructed to very specific criteria, and still functioning due to the stolen power his mutants had managed to provide it. Contained within, still alive, was an infant Primarch, a perfect clone of Fulgrim. Fabius would be allowed to take command back of the Vesalius, but it would now play host to a Legion battle group under the command of Alcanex at Eidolon's orders. Despite this, Fabius managed to smuggle the infant Fulgrim aboard, although he was still unsure what the future would hold for the nascent Primarch. Eidolon would not trust Fabius with the exact coordinates for the planet where he believed the gene tithe was being stored, to avoid having to potentially fight their way across two segmentums or navigating across a vast expanse of the Imperium to reach the eastern fringe. Fabius proposed they travel through the webway using one of the functioning portals in their region of the Eye. Doing so, Fabius predicted they could make the journey in a few weeks. As they travelled, various elements on board plotted Fabius's downfall. All the while, the clone of Fulgrim was aging exponentially, years passing in hours, and as yet there was no sign of corruption, either physical or mental, although he would not be able to hide the young demigod for long. The more time Fabius spent with the young Fulgrim and the more his youthful clone displayed his abilities, Fabius began to have twinges of doubt about his own designs for the future of humanity. Maybe there could be a new Legion, a new Primarch, the third reborn and cleansed of the sins that had claimed it, a third he could guide along his own path. As the Vesalius was crossing the edges of the Maelstrom Zone, it caught the attentions of a strike cruiser of the Red Scimitars chapter, the Space Marines using boarding javelins, a variant of the Ursus Claw contact system to mount a boarding action. Although with the aid of Key, the javelins were expelled, leaving the boarding Astartes stranded. The invaders were driven back to the sealed breach points, and there they sold their lives dearly. Not all were as lucky as to die immediately. The Vesalius arrived at their destination, a dour world in a system all but empty of heavenly bodies, where even the stars were few and far between. A colourless sun that appeared artificial casted cold, dim light over its surface. Fabius hypothesized it was a mechanism for capturing energy from elsewhere and relaying it to the planet. Alcanex would remain on board while Fabius, along with Sakara, the Word-Bearer, Apothecaries Korag of the Death Guard, and Scaragrim of the Sons of Horus, the Glandhounds known as the Twins, Savona, a contingent of the Emperor's children, and a variety of Fabius's loyal mutants would descend to the planet's surface. They would also take Diomat. Fabius was taking no risks this time. Arian and the other Glandhounds would be left on board in anticipation of betrayal by Alcanex. Igori would be tasked with watching over Fulgrim, his presence finally revealed to her by necessity. Descending to the planet on a trio of gunships including the bloodthirsty Butcherbird, the landing party would soon reveal the truth of the planet. They had landed on the Necron tomb world of Solomnis. If you are particularly interested in Solomnis and its galleries, then you will find more details in the Imperium's most wanted entry on its overlord, Trazyn the Infinite. While Fabius and the others began to unveil the mysteries of the tomb world, on board the Vesalius, Alcanex began his bid to seize control. Forces loyal to the prefect ransacked the apothecarium, destroying the clones of Fabius that they found there, but fortunately the clone of Fulgrim, now much more than a youth, was not discovered, and Igori was able to hide him away once more. Igori would call a gathering in secret of the pack leaders of the Glandhounds. They were suspicious and reluctant to follow the matriarch of the largest pack, despite her position as first of firsts among them, and the high regard she was held in by the one they called Benefactor. But once Fulgrim revealed himself to them and spoke rousingly of the future Fabius envisioned for the new men, one by one they knelt before him. As the new men rose to fight against the traitor legionaries that sought to overthrow Fabius, Ramos and the Noise Marines stuck to their own agenda, sealing off their Wraithbone garden and refusing to aid either side in the conflict raging across the decks. Demonettes and other Neverborn began to materialize as Key and Ramos led the cacophony in their song. They sensed the presence of the Fulgrim clone, but despite the temptation to corrupt him and deliver him to Slaanesh, they knew they must bide their time if Fabius too was to be brought to the path of worship of the Dark Prince. On Solomnis, Trazyn's trap was sprung as the landing party wandered through his exhibits. The chemical weapon of Korag the Grave Warden and the intervention of Diomat allowed Fabius time to order the retreat as his war mutants fought the encircling Necrons. Despite the peril of their situation, the Emperor's children loyal to Alcanex in their group chose this moment to attempt to assassinate Fabius, but once again Diomat intervened. As they fought both Necron wraiths and traitor legionaries, the sub-tier on which they stood gave way, and both the chief apothecary and the ancient contemptor dreadnought fell into the chasm below. Both survived the plunge into darkness, although Diomat had been damaged almost beyond saving, and Fabius kept true to his promise to the hero of Walpurgis, and ended the ancient dreadnought's long service. It was only then that the chief archaeovist of the Solomnis galleries made his presence known to Fabius, as Trazyn the Infinite sought to add the chief apothecary to his collection. The negotiation that occurs between Trazyn and Fabius are also highlighted in Trazyn's entry in the Imperium's Most Wanted, and I will not repeat it in too much detail here, but I would highly recommend watching that video and reading it in full for yourself in the Clonelord novel. I'll admit my bias here, as these are two of my favourite characters in the whole of 40k, but the meeting of minds that occurs between these two is everything you'd want it to be. On board the Vesalius, the Glandhounds and mutants, and the Emperor's children led by Alcanex and Merix that had turned on Fabius were engaged in vicious conflicts across the ship. Despite being massively outnumbered, the battle was starting to turn in the traitor's favour, until an all too familiar being made his presence known. and the legionaries began to die. Merrick's would be poised to dispatch Igori when the voice of a Primarch stopped him in his tracks, and caused many of the other renegades to retreat or simply fall on their knees. Protective of Igori, the risen Phoenix would catch Merrick's by the throat in a vice-like grip and strangle the life from him. Arion was fighting his way to the command deck where the overseer Wolvo was waiting. Alcanex had anticipated this move, however, and the bridge erupted into a firefight during which Wolvo was struck by a bolt round, causing massive damage to the overseer of the Stratagem. Surrounded by enemies, Alcanex would demand Arion to surrender and reveal the locations of Fabius's clones, but the World Eater's loyalty to the chief apothecary ran deep, and he refused. Back on Solomnis, the landing party were fighting their way back to the Butcherbird and the other landers, while Fabius negotiated for his freedom with Trazyn. Trazyn would reveal in return for the gene tithe he had been offered Fabius for his collection in a chance meeting with Eidolon on Harmony. Fabius would try to bargain, saying his gene banks were full of samples from worlds without number, and through them Fabius could clone anything Trazyn might desire for his collection. While this piqued the interest of the Lord of the Prismatic Galleries, Trazyn reasoned he could bend the Clonelord to his will over the centuries as part of his collection, and still gain access to such secrets. But just as Trazyn was about to condemn Fabius to his fate as an exhibit, the troop of Harlequins once again made an appearance. As Trazyn had not encountered them before, Fabius offered them to him in return for his own freedom. Vale Walker once more addressed the one they called the King of Feathers, claiming to be there to save him from a future in captivity and set him upon the path that fate decreed. But Fabius had baited them into Trazyn's trap, a swarm of scarabs descending on the capricious Eldari before Trazyn's Necron warriors advanced from the gloom around them. Vale Walker would berate Fabius for making deals with beings beyond his comprehension, but with the rest of the troops succumbing to the scarabs or dying to the fire of the advancing Necrons, the leader of the Harlequins disappeared once more. Fabius had bought himself safe passage to his ship with the delivery of the Harlequins to Trazyn, but he was still to bargain for the gene tithe. Trazyn still wanted to acquire Fabius for his collection, so asked for one of Fabius's clones and a neural copy of his mind to go with it. Fabius agreed if Trazyn not only provided the gene tithe, but ensured the Vesalius remained in the Clonelord's control. Unbeknownst to Fabius, the arrival of the Fulgrim clone had swung the battle decisively against the renegade Emperor's children, and he rampaged through them, killing with poise and grace, while most retreated, grovelling before him. The clone demanded to know who had caused the rebellion as he cut a path of red ruin through the traitors, and soon he was bearing down on Alcanex, who was still locked in combat with the injured World Eater Arion. At first Alcanex could not comprehend the majestic being advancing on him, and fired a single shot of his bolt pistol that struck Igori as she flung herself in front of the clone. In that moment, Fabius and Trazyn materialized with a crackle of displaced air. Fabius realized he faced an army of his own creation, but they were an army loyal to Fulgrim and willing to die for him. To him they would be his warriors, and this was not the future he'd envisioned for his new men. A future of servitude to a risen phoenix, a Primarch reborn. As Alcanex fell to his knees and pledged his allegiance to the clone of the Phoenician, Fabius saw in the smile that played across Fulgrim's perfect features the ghost of the arrogant creature that had fallen into darkness, the monster that valued his own perfection above the lives of his sons. In that moment, Fabius made his decision and offered Trazyn an alteration to their bargain. He would not see his new men used as tools at the behest of a legion reborn under their cloned lord. Fulgrim's eyes blazed with awareness awoken in battle, and Fabius knew he could never deny what he truly was, even without the taint of the Dark Prince's corruption. He had almost let the future burn in the fires of the risen Phoenix. His great work would all be for nothing. He saw them now, his new men, abasing themselves before their perfect lord. He would not allow it. He could not. Fabius offered Trazyn the clone of Fulgrim, despite the howled protestations of both legionary and new man alike. Alcanex implored him to reconsider, and rushed at the chief apothecary and the Necron overlord who sought to add their Primarch to his collection. With a gesture, Trazyn froze Alcanex, Fulgrim and the remaining renegade legionaries in place, and Fabius offered them all to him. Trazyn was pleased with this fine addition to his collection, and informed Fabius that the gene tithe had been transported to the cargo hold of the Vesalius as agreed. The overlord of Solomnis vanished once more, and Fulgrim and the others vanished with him, leaving Fabius alone on the command deck. As he dismissed the surviving Glandhounds back to their lairs below decks, he received word from the damaged Wolver that the Butcherbird was returning to dock, carrying the other survivors of his expedition to the tomb world below. The Clonelord returned to his apothecarium to tend to Igori's wounds, and was informed by Scalagrim and Meishana, the surviving twin, that Korag, Sakara, and Savona had all also survived the attack of the Necrons. Since giving up the clone, Fabius swung between blind rage and deep despair, and soon he dismissed them to be alone with his inner conflict. Only when the chief apothecary was alone did Veil Walker reveal itself once more. It would acknowledge that this story was ending, but a new one was beginning. Endings and beginnings, over and over again. Such was the way of theatre. They all have endings, it said, except for Fabius. For him there would be no ending, no cessation, no peace. He could not even perceive the trap that held him. Fabius would pour scorn on its prophetic words, claiming he would end once his new men were ready to rise up and claim the future of humanity for themselves without his guidance. All hint of hilarity gone, the Harlequin would strut forward and swing its staff at the prone form of Igori, a blow Fabius barely blocked. How long could he protect them, it inquired. Then with one final flourish it produced a data spike in its palm, a gift to set him on his path to the beginning of the next story, the only gift it claimed would matter to Fabius. Inserting it into a data port, a scroll of information spilled across the hololithic screen of the Cogitator panel, a map of the webway showing the path to Comora. I hope you've enjoyed our journey together today, and I've earned your subscription, and I'll see you again in the near future where there is only war.